Dr. Ruchi Chaturvedi, an Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Cape Town, is a distinguished political and legal anthropologist. With a PhD from Columbia University, she authored Violence of Democracy, which examines majoritarian violence in democratic systems. Her work explores the intersections of democracy, politics, and violence in post-colonial societies, focusing on India and South Africa. Her research also highlights the pivotal role of women's groups in these regions. Dr. Chaturvedi is a key voice in shaping social science education in South Africa.
Think about the violence as something which is almost, this is a part of North Kerala's martial culture, or people are hot-headed and hot-blooded here. Actually, we get an insight into how democracies themselves work to produce divisions within communities. How is it that it starts to matter to a point that people do rigging, people do use all kinds of means to win the election? Why does it, what is it that democracy is doing here? Actually, democracy, which as you said, is supposed to be something that produces non-aggression, non-violence in a way. We had a big romance about Kerala, about Kerala's left history, Kerala's communist history. In Kerala, when I first began coming here, was with this phenomena of violence between the CPM and RSS. I started work, like I was saying, early 2000s. Before that, P. Jayarajan, who was sort of one of the regional stalwarts of CPM, he had been brutally attacked. There was sort of a series of attacks and counter-attacks that were happening.
The Malabarjournal is in conversation with Ruchi Chaturvedi. Welcome. Thank you, ma'am, for agreeing to talk to us.
Thank you, Dhiren.
Let's talk about your book first.
Sure.
So in your book, one of the key argument is violence in democracy, the concept of violence of democracies. So it's contrary to the popular belief that democracy in itself is breeding violence, which is a new concept to us. So could you please elaborate on that?
So as you know, what is at the heart of the book is this long conflict that started in the 1960s between Communist Party of India, Marxist workers, and what we call the Hindu right, RSS, BJP, Jansangh at that time. I mean, that's sort of the main history that the book is telling, the history of that violence, going into the early 2000s, when it starts to shift and change a little bit the nature of the violence. But I started work on the violence, on this phenomena in the early 2000s. And I took a long time to write the book. And part of the reason for taking that kind of time, I think, was, of course, the intensity and nature of the violence, which requires you to think about it quite carefully and slowly, but also sort of try to not think about it as something that is almost peculiar to Kerala or peculiar to North Kerala. I'm not from Kerala. I grew up in India. I studied in India. I've been, working and living outside of India. But it was my experience that a lot of people, firstly, didn't know about the violence and for a long time. But within Kerala, many people, of course, here, of course, it was a very well-known phenomena. But they would think about the violence as something which is almost, this is a part of North Kerala's martial culture, or people are hot-headed and hot-blooded here, or people do kalaripetta and have old feuds and so on. And they were only thinking about the violence in those terms. Now, of course, those things play an important role, but Kerala, CPM, Hindu right, they're all part of a modern political phenomena, which is the phenomena of electoral democracy, of what is called representative democracy. So what I'm trying to sort of say in the book is that actually, when we look closely at the way in which violence sort of emerged in this region, in the North Kerala region, in Kannur district, and when we look at it closely and over a period of time, what we start seeing is actually we get an insight into how democracies themselves work to produce divisions within communities. And democracies themselves, I say this because, we think that actually when people are competing with each other, when it's only electoral politics. If they lose, they lose, and it shouldn't matter so much. But how is it that it starts to matter to a point that people do rigging, people do use all kinds of means to win the election? Why does it, what is it that democracy is doing here? More than that, if you look across the world, if you look at places, I'm almost in many, many parts of the world. If you look at Kenya, if you look at Sri Lanka, or even if you look at a place like North America, where you have a Donald Trump and he's appealing to people's identities as white Americans.
Yes.
He is, or if you look in Europe, you have a Marine Le Pen. She's appealing to people's identities as Europeans, and there's almost sort of a kind of a white supremacy going on there. So they're appealing to those people's identities in order to win votes. They have other kinds of, there are other things playing into the picture, but a lot of it has to do with the sheer fact of wanting to win a constituency or win as much popularity and win as much popular support and electoral support as they can. So what I try to sort of think through is, how is it that actually democracy, which, as you said, is supposed to be something that produces non-aggression, non-violence in a way, but it actually divides people in ways that they start appealing to these identities in order to win the elections. Democracies become something only about winning or largely about winning. So democracies are supposed to be something that give us equality, give us freedom of thought and expression and so forth. But we know that equality is also very, it's not real in the sense that it's only political equality. We can all compete to fight elections and win elections. Substantively, we're not really equal, right? There's class divisions, ethnic divisions, and so on and so forth. And all of those divisions get mobilized within democracies to produce divisions amongst us. And that's the kind of process that had been happening in Kannur also for a long period of time, that those divisions were getting produced as people, as parties were competing for popular and electoral support. And those divisions got produced to a point that they turned violent and people turned against each other. So that's sort of the overall concept of why I'm saying that there is a propensity within democracies to produce that aggressive competition, to produce that aggression amongst groups that are fighting for power, and hence to produce violence amongst each other. So that's sort of where the larger concept of thinking about violence of democracy sort of comes.
You have done an extensive research in Kannur and came to this argument. And mostly your work is around the RSS and CPIM violence. And also you are, in the book, you're talking about the concepts of scholars like Partha Chatterjee. So my question is, why, how do you come to the decision that your research has to be in Kannur? And then do you think, can you talk about the work you have undertaken in Kannur during your period of research?
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, I think, like I was saying earlier, I grew up in North India.
Yeah.
And we had a big romance about Kerala, about Kerala's left history, Kerala's, communist history. And I shared in the romance, and I, shared in the romance. And and of course, everybody acknowledges the ways in which that history has contributed and welfare regimes have contributed to Kerala being a much better place than many parts of the country and the world. So with that sort of, so as a young person, I wanted to work on Kerala or wanted to sort of work on the left. But my own encounters in Kerala when I first began coming here was with this phenomena of violence between the CPM and RSS. I started work, like I was saying, early 2000s. And at the time, for those of people who know, Jay Krishnan Master, an RSS school teacher, had just been killed. There were killings in the wake of that. Before that, P. Jayarajan, who was sort of one of the regional stalwarts of CPM, he had been brutally attacked. There was sort of a series of attacks and counterattacks that were happening. And I think what I was also sort of encountering was within Kerala a kind of a dissension and a concern and disturbance about what is the nature of politics that's happening, even in the name of the left, and then what is the right coming in and doing. So somewhere, I mean, my own, like I was saying, I had this sort of romantic vision of what Kerala might bring. And at the same time, like many other people in North India, I too was in college and school, you saw the Babri Masjid come down. You were sort of concerned about the rise of the Hindu right in the country. And I think then those reasons drew me to this topic. The process of doing research meant spending, as much time as I could here, getting to know some of the people who had been accused of the violence, who had suffered the violence, as closely as possible. I was doing work in the courts in the sense I would attend people's trials, talk to their lawyers, try to sort of get that picture from different ends. Their own, individual biographies of individuals who were involved, and then what the court system was doing to them. It was also work that required me to take some distance from this, both because it's a contentious space. You're talking to people on both sides. You have to be mindful and respectful of their positions. And these are young men who had been enacting and suffering violence, and young men from lower class, what are called lower class, so-called lower caste backgrounds, with their own precarity, with their own anxieties, with their own worries. So while on the one hand you had a critique of the violence inside you, you also had a respect for the people who had come to be suffering it, or doing violence is also a form of suffering in a way. Doing violence also causes a certain kind of a stress. So it required coming close, but also stepping back, and in a difficult sort of situation when you're talking to both groups, stepping away a little bit. So I did work in the early 2000s. I came back after I finished my PhD. I came back again when the Sangh was having a big rally, as you know, in 2017 across the state. So much was changing in the country as well. So try to think of this place in relationship to the country. Try to think of this place in relationship to the rest of the world, which has seen sort of a big rise of the right and democracies across the world. So that has been the attempt, and then finally finishing the book, which got published last year.
When you talk about this violence of democracies, or the minoritization or polarization in democracies, when you talk about the situation in US and in other countries, there is a racial, polarization. But in the situation in Kannur is unique. The people here are from the same social class and so on. So how do you explain that?
Yeah, no, that's a very important and very good question. And to my mind, I mean, in the book, I describe Kannur as an exceptional normal place. So I use that phrase, exceptional normal, to say that there are some things that are unique about this conflict. The major thing which is unique, which you just said, that people from both sides are more or less from the same social backgrounds, same religious, same caste, class, relatively same backgrounds. I'm talking about the people on the ground who are actually doing the violence, or who get accused of it, or who suffer it. And as opposed to other parts of the country or the world where it's like Hindu, Muslim, ethnic divisions or racial divisions and so on. But so this is one of the exceptional things. The other exceptional thing is also how violence has been intergenerational. It's been over several decades, and at some points it's taken very very ghastly and heinous forms. So in that sense, it's exceptional. And at the same time, I talk about this thing of phenomena of exceptional normal, that if an exceptional phenomena can actually make us think about what is happening in many parts of the world. That is something which is much more general. That is something much more widespread. So with Kerala, I mean, with Kannur itself, what I would say is that what it allows us to see is how, in spite of the fact that people are not don't have these religious enmities or ethnic enmities and so on, in spite of the fact there's kind of the process of homogenization and polarization, unity and division. That process is so integral to how politics is happening that even in a situation where people are not necessarily divided along ethnic or religious lines, that those identities are not politicized. That political process produces divided identities. And people get divided, almost in some ways. Also, we mustn't forget that violence itself produces its own force. So people get, once a sort of cycle of violence starts, people themselves get more bound to each other for the sake of support, and then questions of retribution. So those communities, violence itself sort of produces communities. And it becomes a long, ongoing cycle, which we've seen in many parts of the world, and we've seen here as well. In other parts of the world, their identities as Kikuyu or Luo or Tamil or Sinhala or Hindu or Muslim were getting mobilized. Here you found that identities across party lines were getting mobilized, but at some level or the other, what was happening was this competitiveness, which was fueling that, and competition for electoral and popular power. So, yeah.
So, do you think there are any other specificities that trigger violence in Kannur? Or in other words, why the violence is not spread in other states of Kerala? Why specifically to Kannur? Are there any specificities to this particular area?
Yeah, I I really hope other people do work on this as well. I think mine is sort of, I know there are other people, there's Sridharan, who's done work in Kannur University. I've seen some new MPhil theses and so on emerging. And I think that question of specificities and what is peculiar to Kerala is probably going to be best studied by somebody, or Kannur, by people who have sort of especially linguistic abilities that I did not.
Okay.
And I think the longer histories, and this is sort of said over and over again, that this is the land of clans and feuds. I don't want to, like I said, I'm really not keen to exceptionalize Kannur for those reasons. I don't think it is not spread to other parts of Kerala. Forms of that violence have happened in other parts of Kerala as well. And like I said, forms of that violence also have happened in other parts of the country and the world. What is peculiar to Kannur is, of course, its very strong left history, where people were, this was the place where the oldest agitations and the most sort of most vigorous agitations, peasant agitations and so forth, that were coming out of from the 1940s, 30s onwards, right? So that's very peculiar. That's a really, I think that's, I think that's a thing that we do need to understand. And most definitely, there is a way in which the Sangh mobilization has happened in many parts of the country and world. But when you start doing mobilization in a space where there is another force present, then you also you each responding to each other in this with the same way. So I call it a mimetic struggle. I call it something where the left and right to some extent start mirroring each other. And they almost, I say there's like a feedback loop that happens. So one thing happens and then another thing, so the violence keeps feeding into itself. So this feedback loop and this sort of mimesis between the two, while there are very important differences between the left and the right, but in some respects they start mirroring each other as well. So yeah, I think while I'm mindful that there are things that are very peculiar to North Kerala, what tends to happen is then it just becomes about that kind of peculiarities, and you think, yeah, it's their problem, or it's a case of a few bad apples, or it's a case of the bad party leader or the bad party. But it's not. It's something that is actually asking us to think much more broadly and think about the political systems we have inherited. And yeah.
What was the role of women in this violence-torn area, or how were they affected by this violence? Have you get a chance to work on
Sure, yeah. I think before I speak about the role of women, I might actually like to speak about the role of masculinities. So my approach in a way has been less to think about gender as only about women, but gender as something which is actually pushing us to think about the ways in which politics itself is masculinized. And I talk about the ways in which a certain kind of hegemonic, this is a phrase that
Yes.
scholars use, hegemonic masculinity or hegemonic political masculinity that has emerged. And there's great work which has been done both outside Kerala and the other parts of the country, and work that scholars like Devika and others have been doing here. And what it shows us that there's the ways in which political masculinity was emerging in post-independence Kerala was twofold. One, you looked after your supporters. One, that you were the person who was kind and caring and doing welfare for people, helping them with constructions of their homes. Somebody was sick, helping them with these small matters of life. And those small matters of life actually then also translate into what we call a welfare regime. Or the social worker thinks of, or the political worker thinks of himself as a social worker, right? Doing good for a neighborhood, for a community, for a village, which gives you a certain kind of stature and it gives you a certain kind of legitimacy. And the other was to be the rebel. The other was to be the fist upholding, slogan shouting, protester, right? And that fist, holding, slogan shouting, hard, almost something machoistic. Male or that masculine figure is another kind of a political figure that sort of emerge, becomes hegemonic. And when we think of politics, we think, oh, the man who's able to get legitimacy because he's got support in a community, or the one who's able to manipulate parties and electoral politics in some way, or who's that activist person on the ground. And in some sense, the way the violence itself emerges through a connection between all these. And especially the latter, the last one, has an important role in what we see as aggression and violence doesn't have to be always physical. There's a ways in which when you undermine people, that's also a certain form of violation.
Yes.
Minoritizing is a certain form of violation. So I think I think we've inherited these kind of ways of doing and thinking about politics. And like I was saying earlier, this kind of competitive, when democracy is only about competition for power, or largely about that fuels this kind of masculinity, and one fuels the other. And where women were concerned, my own, like I said, my first port of call were actually the men who were engaged in the violence. And when you do this kind of work, you also have to respect the boundaries they set for you. So of course, there's a way in which people don't necessarily want you to go and talk to their families if they're talking about enacting or suffering violence. There's limited scope for doing that. You talk to families, but also you also maintain that distance. So I found myself maintaining that boundary to an extent in the course of doing my research. When I did manage to speak to more women, my experience was that they were on the whole quite supportive of what the male political figures in their families were doing. They were not necessarily dissenting. I did not encounter dissent in that way. But I would think of feminization of politics in a whole other way, where you think of, a feminist way of doing democracy would be hopefully something different. But no, I didn't encounter that kind of undermining of that masculinity.
In your book, you're mentioning some of the women were providers in their house.
Definitely, and that's, I think, a Kerala-wide phenomena where where the husband or the father or the brother is the one who is the political agent or the party member or the Sangh member, and women are the ones who do bring the bread and butter. I mean, and I think one thing that we all need to be really mindful of is, which is very interesting, is how the Hindu right, for instance, has managed to make an appeal to families, to entire kinship networks, in a way that other political formations and other, might not have been able to. So I think the ways in which kinship relations and women get appealed to by the Hindu right, needs to be understood and grappled with. Yeah.
Your research was in 2000 in that period, and your book was published in 2023. So was there any particular reason for this? Of course, you have published a lot of articles in the period,
Yeah.
but still your book got late.
Yeah. Yeah. No, like I was sort of saying, I think back on the reasons in some ways. I think, like I was saying earlier, I did need to step back from the intensity of this experience. So I finished my PhD in 2007, which is also based on this research. I came back in 2009 and 10. Life happens, but 2014, as you know, we saw the coming of the first Modi regime. And I think all of that just gave me some pause. I felt the need to pause and think through what was going on.
Okay.
I mean, and just like nationally, there was a certain kind of an intensification of violence in the name of, by the ruling Democratic Party, or the ruling party of one of the biggest democracies in the world. So I needed to think through what's the relationship between Kannur and India, and the rest of India. What's the relationship between Kannur, India, and the rest of the world? I mean, and my own location has been shifting. So I was based in the US when I was studying there, when I first started my research, always a foot in India. But at the same time, I then moved to South Africa. And I think these different locations gave me a different kind of perspective and new questions to think through. So I did not want to write a book or I found myself not wanting to write a book which is very localized, only about Kannur, but saying to people in Kannur that you are a part of a larger global thing, a phenomena that has a longer history. And the rest of the world also Kannur becomes a way of us trying to understand that larger global history. So there was this sort of two-way thing, and I think partly the reason for taking the time is about trying to think through these different perspectives, trying to think through what's happening in contemporary India. And not necessarily exceptionalize Kannur, even though, like I said, Kannur has its exceptions.
You have argued that in Kannur, there is this violence because of this competitive pressure between the representative democracies. So when we were talking about the Modi reign in 2014. So after that, there is a sudden stoppage in the violence in Kannur, even after 2014, and when CPIM came into power in 2016. So some critics of CPIM specifically, they argue that there is a tactical deal between the RSS and the CPIM. So do you have a speculation? What do you think about it?
Look, I mean, 2017 was very interesting. 2017 was when there were posters about violence that had happened here put all around Delhi University, right? And really grotesque and gruesome posters. And 2017 is when you had a yatra in Kannur, where the biggest Hindu right-wing leaders were here. And I was, I managed to be in Trivandrum at the time when the yatra was concluding, and watch. I was visiting Talasheri, but reading in the papers, and then went to Trivandrum to see how it all ended, and we know that from Adityanath to everyone was there. So so I think timing wise, that's an interesting moment. And that was also the moment when there was, in Madhya Pradesh, there's a man who says that he put that whoever will take retribution for the killings of Sangh workers will be given an award and so on. Right? So there's this interesting phenomena that happens. And then it starts, it does fade away, like you say. I think speculation is probably just, it can only be that. There has to be more than just a directive from the top. A lot of the conversation has to happen at the bottom. And containing those smaller feuds as well, or the smaller clash, the smaller group clashes as well, or the smaller animosities as well, has to be a very important part of containing the violence. And I think if there has been work which has been consciously and deliberately been done, it's probably at that ground level to contain those animosities, to not let a small skirmish turn into something that becomes bigger between the two groups, or to not let retribution happen. We know that since the early 2000s, there's also not just party workers, but other kinds of agents who've been involved. And I'm not in a well-placed to speak about that. But obviously there's been some ways in which there's been a conscious attempt to not turn to those kind of hired hands and so on, and placate. And when that happens, democracy does become something which can be peaceful.
Current political scenario in South Africa. So if you see, the ANC has lost its majority after 30 years. Like, do you think it's similar? It has similarity with how International Congress has lost power after 30 years in India. So do you think there are similarities between the politics in India and South Africa, the political dynamics?
Yeah.
Also adding to that, the ANC has now taken support from the right, if I'm not wrong, Democratic Alliance, who are supporters of apartheid. So how do you see the situation?
I think there is definitely a parallel between what happened to the ANC and the Indian National Congress. And again, scholars have written about this. They were anticipating something like this for a long time. South Africa is very similar to many parts of the world, but South Africa of course has its, having been under apartheid from 48. I mean, India gets independence in 47. South Africa, apartheid starts in 48.
Yes.
And goes on all the way till 94. And what's very, what term that is used to understand South Africa is settler colonial. South Africa, unlike many other colonial spaces, India and others, the white man did not leave, right?
Yes.
But there was a new sort of dispensation where you understood that that people who were the white minority rulers are also people in the constructive and the most problematic senses of the word. Settlers in this region have settled in this region. They have a home in this region, and out of that comes what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and this particular understanding of South Africa as a rainbow nation, and so on. Again, with a range of problems. Those of people who know South Africa will remember that late 80s and early 1990s were a very difficult moment. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and happens, and the pact that happens to give power to the black majority happens in very, very difficult conditions, and it could have turned into a full-blown civil war. Or that violence was very intensely happening in many parts of the countries. At that moment, different kinds of compromises were also made. And what is very frequently said in South Africa is that we got political democracy, but not social equality. You got political justice in that sense, but not social justice. Questions of land, housing. I these are some of the most important questions in South Africa, and they remain. So what is so-called the left has makes a call for land redistribution. The ANC has also sort of made calls for land redistribution and so forth. But sometimes those slogans also get mobilized, as we know, for a range of reasons by people who are not necessarily the left and so on. ANC made this pact at that moment where they said political equality right now, and we see what happens with social, which is again another longer story. Its pact with DA is part of that story in a way because the Democratic Alliance, yes, comes out of old parties that were regarded, that were at the helm of the apartheid government. At the same time, it's also made up of people who were themselves, positioned in significant ways and the anti-apartheid struggle, albeit from the white liberal groups. So it's not, we can end up caricaturing the Democratic Alliance. I'm not sort of a flag bearer of the Democratic Alliance, but I don't want to caricature them either. So I think what's happening is this moment when a new settlement would have to happen. That in a way, it's a revisiting of the 94 moment when you did have to come together to form a government that would bring a new transition. Now you're back at the point when people are not necessarily aggrieved politically, but they're very aggrieved socially. In terms of social inequality, in terms of unemployment, in terms of simple basics and food security and so on. So can sort of a new transition in that sense happen with these two, a black majority and a party which sees itself as a representative of the black majority, and a party that has been associated with the white minority? Can it sort of then bring about a new transition? I think that's sort of, it's very early days. But yeah, I'm not entirely hoping for the best. Yeah.
That's it, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you.